Riot recently released their tentative PBE patch notes for the upcoming Mythic items, as well as new legendary items and changed existing items. And it's a lot to take in, so I thought I'd break it down piece by piece and start with what I know, which is the Mythic tank items. I am a tank player, so who better than me to break this down? So first, let's just look at all three items. You have Sunfire Aegis, which is replacing Sunfire Cape. You have Frostfire Gauntlet, which is replacing Iceborne Gauntlet. And you have Berserker Suit that is replacing Righteous Glory. So the first thing that you'll notice is that they're all 3,200 gold, and they all give you varying amounts of health, armor, magic resist, and ability haste. Looks like Sunfire Aegis gives you the most health, Frostfire Gauntlet gives you the most armor, and Berserker Suit gives you the most MR. And for those of you who don't know, 15 ability haste is worth roughly 13 CDR. So I think based first impression, I like this because a lot of the times the item that you want to build is highly predicated on whether you want armor or MR. So you might build a item you don't want to build just because you need MR or armor in a certain game. So I actually like this change because it kind of just gives you all around stats, and then you can kind of just focus on what the active or passives are to these items. So when looking at these passives and actives, the first thing I noticed is all three of them now have immolate. And I haven't been able to find anywhere that shows the actual build paths of these items. I don't have access to the PBE, but I would assume that all three of these items build out of some version of Bommy's Cinder if they give you the immolate passive. I also like this. I'm a huge fan of the immolate passive. It's great for wave clear. It's just great for sitting on enemies and doing damage to them. And I think it's awesome that you basically have three different flavors of it that you can go. It's not as strong. If you look at the numbers, it's slightly weaker than the full Sunfire Cape damage, but I I like the Immolate edition here. Probably the most interesting of the three Mythic tank items is the Sunfire Aegis because it's adding a passive that is not currently in the game called Radiance, which is also there's an extra sentence in the Immolate passive that sort of ties into Radiance, which basically means when you damage enemy champions or epic monsters, you generate stacks, and then eventually at max stacks, your basic attacks will explode, dealing even more damage. So not only are you ramping up in damage, but you're also, once you hit max, you explode. So it almost reminds me of like an Alistar thing where you get the ticks and then eventually you get the stun. That's kind of how I see it as, is you're basically sitting on someone waiting for your ticks to get max stacks. And then additionally, it looks like each of these mythic items gives you once you complete a legendary item, which to my knowledge, a legendary item is basically just a completed non-mythic item. So basically, most of the items in the game are going to count as legendary items, except for, I believe, boots. I don't think boots would count. So Sunfire Aegis's mythic passive means that it grants all other legendary items plus 5 ability haste. And I think that's great to have because in addition to the already 15 ability haste that you get, you will have an additional 20 because in theory, right, you have your mythic item, you have your boots that allows you for 4 slots for legendary items. So if you have 20 ability haste from that passive, and then you have 15 ability haste from the item, that's a total of 35 ability haste, which is worth roughly 25.9 CDR. So that's a lot of CDR. This might be my favorite out of the three, just because you get the crazy ramping damage from the passive, and you get all that CDR. So I think this is looking like a cool item. Next up is Frostfire Gauntlet, which looks to be the most changed out of the three, because Iceborne Gauntlet used to give you mana and armor and CDR, and now it gives you all the stats that I mentioned before: health, MR, ability haste, armor. So more in line with the typical tank build, which I'm a fan of. And it looks like they basically took the Icy Zone passive and moved it over to Frostfire. It basically is the same thing, but what looks to be different is how it's procced because they took, it looks like since Frostfire Gauntlet doesn't give you mana, it looks like they did take the Spellblade passive out of Iceborne Gauntlet. So I would assume that this no longer builds out of a Sheen. Um, so you're taking out the Spellblade, you're taking out the mana, but it says attacks create a frost field that slows enemies with a 4-second cooldown. So I take that to believe just auto attacks, or spells perhaps. It's not specific. So I think that's a great addition, that it can just be procced by auto attacks. They removed Frozen Mallet from the game, or they're going to remove Frozen Mallet from the game, so that maybe kind of is going to replace Frozen Mallet. And then the Mythic passive is grants all other legendary items 100 health and 7.5% size. So at 4 legendary items, it's plus 400 health and 30% size. I'm not huge on the size, but the plus 400 health is nothing to sneeze at, and that just makes it an even better tank item. And lastly, we have Berserker Suit, which has an active that is basically the almost exact same thing as the active of Righteous Glory. And similar to Iceborne Gauntlet, it no longer gives mana, but it does give you the tank stats across the board. And its mythic passive is that all other legendary items give plus 5% tenacity, so up to 20% tenacity, which that is also pretty good. That means if you have that, so Merc Treads is 30% tenacity, so that means if you have a full build with Berserker Suit and Merc Treads, you will have 50% tenacity. So your slow resist is half, and you're getting CC'd for half as long. So that's kind of that's kind of crazy. Um, I think Berserker Suit. There's not too much to say about that. It's basically Righteous Glory, um, and that concludes the Mythic Tank items official rundown. And those are my thoughts as a tank player. So hopefully that made things maybe a little more simple.